Denise Dresser is a prominent Mexican political analyst, columnist, and academic. Forbes recently listed her as one of the 50 most powerful women in Mexico. With almost 5 million followers on X, former Twitter, she is also one of the most influential opinion leaders in her country. She was recently awarded the Legion of Honor by the French government for her work on democracy, justice, gender equality, and human rights. Denise recently visited Ukraine. In our conversation, she shares her conclusions from her visit, a global view of how democracies are becoming fragile worldwide, including in Latin America, and why Ukraine's fight matters to the rest of the world. You're listening to the UkraineWorld podcast and its series, Thinking in Dark Times. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, chief editor of UkraineWorld, and president of PEN Ukraine. UkraineWorld is a multilingual media about Ukraine brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of Ukraine's largest media NGOs. You can support us at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. You can also support our volunteer trips to the war zones at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. This episode is produced in partnership with the Ukrainian Institute, the country's major public and cultural diplomacy institution. Denise Dresser, welcome to this podcast.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm happy to be participating from Mexico City.
Yeah, so I was very happy to meet you in Kyiv, and thank you for the courage to come. But let me ask you about your impressions of your visits to Ukraine, of your conversations with Ukrainians. What have you learned, and what is your estimation of this war, of the Russian invasion?
Well, first of all, I don't think my going there is an act of courage compared to what you are living through. I would say that Ukrainians are truly the courageous ones. I went to Ukraine for the first time a year and a half ago, invited by Natalia Gumenyuk. I went with a group of Latin American journalists because she had put together a program bringing people from the global south to Ukraine so that they could understand truly what was happening. We were the first group to go. And I spent 10 days in Ukraine and then returned just a couple of weeks ago because Ukraine, in my perspective, not only is it dear to my heart, and I have enormous admiration for the sophistication, the beauty, the resilience, the courage of the country facing what seem at times like insurmountable odds, but also because it is a conflict that illustrates the challenges that the world faces in the 21st century. I went to the Yalta Security Conference while I was in Kyiv, and one of the participants said that this war is the first war of imperialism of the 21st century, because we hadn't witnessed since the Second World War another country just grab land for the sake of it, as Russia has done, with expansionist, imperialist designs in mind. And this has put the international community to a test that we don't know if it will pass, because from what I've seen since the full-scale invasion began, there are times when I've been in Ukraine when spirits have been higher. For example, when I was there 2.5 years ago, it was the beginning of the offensive, of the counteroffensive, that did not really go as Ukraine had expected. And now I sense, not among Ukrainians who are as defiant and as brave as ever, but among many of the diplomats who were at the Yalta European Security Conference, a sense that Ukraine at some point will have to recognize reality, sign some sort of peace accord with Russia, ceding territory, and that Europeans might ultimately grow tired of supporting Ukraine, which I think would be a terrible mistake, given everything that I've witnessed there. Ukraine has done what no one expected. The world did not expect Ukraine to fight so bravely, so fiercely, and be able to, for example, resist the Russian onslaught in Kyiv, or even take control of parts of Russian territory in Kursk. So I think the problem, particularly coming from Latin America, is that it seems so far away for us, and the global South, sadly, is encompasses many countries that view the United States as the imperial power, do not view Russia as the imperial power, and there's been a great deal of Russian activity in the global South, spreading disinformation and propaganda, shaping views about the war in Ukraine. So that if there was initially a great deal of solidarity, that solidarity has been undermined over the course of the last 2.5 years.
Thank you for these words about Ukraine, and this is really encouraging to hear them from Mexico, from far away. So there is a big distance between us. When I look at Latin America, different Latin American countries, I never have been to your wonderful continent, unfortunately. Although I was invited several times, but it was kind of a fatal events that didn't let me go. But there are people who are coming, and we have on our podcast, on this UkraineWorld podcast, I have conversations with Argentinians, with Colombians, with Brazilians, and the thing that I hear all the time is that, look, generally the citizens who know little, even though they know little about what is going on, they sympathize with Ukrainians. They have empathy towards the fight of Ukrainians, the sufferings of Ukrainians. But at the same time, there is politics, and politics is different because we have Brazil, which is part of BRICS, and different phrases by Lula. We have Mexico and your previous president, and he's kind of a complaining that America spends so much money on Ukraine, and the new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, correct me if my spelling is wrong, saying that she would not come to Ukraine because she would not interfere into foreign affairs. And at the same time, when you look at the way how Latin American countries, including Mexico, vote in General Assembly resolutions, they vote mostly they will mostly for the wording which says Russia should leave Ukraine. So how to really understand this kind of clash, this ambiguity?
I think you can't speak of a unified Latin American position on Ukraine precisely because of what you said. There are different political dynamics within each country. In Brazil, for example, Lula wants to assert himself as a leader of the global South, and he has strong economic connections with China, and wants to position himself as a kind of neutral force in the region. And then you have someone like Milei, the right-wing president of Argentina, who has vocally expressed support for Ukraine. You have the left-wing government of Gabriel Boric in Chile that has been very supportive in its stance of Ukraine as well. And then you have kind of ambiguous positions of Colombia, where Colombia, Brazil, and Argentina, I think at some point tried to present a peace plan so that the conflict was stalled for 5 years. I think Mexico participated in that plan. And I remember speaking with Zelensky about this, and he said, that's a non-starter for us because seizing the conflict, freezing it for 5 years, the only thing that it would entail would be for Russia to dig in and fortify the regions that it already controls and then invade us again. So internal political dynamics, I think, explain the different positions on Ukraine. And regarding Mexico, I would say that our position has been shameful. Not the country's position, not the population's position, but the previous president's position, as well as the current president's position. And this comes from, once again, internal politics, because Mexico is a country that has a history of being invaded by the United States. We lost half our territory to the US in the 19th century, and we were brought up to view the US as the enemy, as the the hegemon that one should be afraid of. And there is sadly a history of American interventionism in the region, supporting coups and toppling governments that went against its interests, particularly in the 1960s and 70s. So when you talk about imperialism in Latin America, most people automatically think of the United States. And our previous president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, very much played to his base, to anti-American sentiment, even though Mexico is part of the North American trade agreement. We are completely economically intertwined with the United States and with Canada because of this trade agreement. We are the US's largest trading partner. We've displaced China. So the rhetoric goes against the reality, but nonetheless, for political reasons, López Obrador said that he wanted to remain neutral and respect Mexico's policy of non-intervention, which was completely contradictory to other stances of intervention that he took in countries where Mexico actually had fights, diplomatic disputes in Latin America, including Peru, Bolivia. So it was a kind of a hypocritical stance on the part of our president, who intervened at times, but then said he didn't want to intervene in the Ukraine conflict. And as we know, neutrality in the case of Russia and Ukraine ultimately supports Russia. And Mexico is a peculiar case, and I think the world should know more about this, of a growing Russian presence here. I mean, Russia's presence is expanding, I'd say, throughout the region in terms of geostrategic positioning via misinformation, propaganda, trying to create chaos, undermine democratic governments. But an interesting factoid is that after the full-scale invasion, I think over 60 Russian diplomats were kicked out of Europe, and they ended up at the Mexican embassy. I mean, at the Russian embassy in Mexico. The Russian embassy here is now the largest Russian embassy in the world outside of Washington. And the research that some journalists have done, Dolia Esteves and others, suggest that the embassy here is being used as a hub for the spread of disinformation and propaganda. When I went the first time to Ukraine and I started tweeting and posting what I was seeing, and I wrote 5 or 6 articles. The Russian embassy started trolling me on Twitter, attacking me on Twitter, and they did so this time again after I published a long piece in Nexos, which is the Mexican version of the New Yorker. It's the most important cultural, literary, political magazine in the country. I published my second letter from Ukraine with reflections on what I'd seen, what I'd lived, and the testimonies of many people that I'd interviewed, including you. You are quoted in that piece, which I'm happy to share with your readers. But the Russian embassy just couldn't help itself and started saying that, of course, everything that I was arguing was false, and that Ukraine had started the aggression, and Ukraine was controlled by Nazis, and Ukraine had bombed the Donbass, and the typical arguments that Russia makes. So what Russia has discovered is that it's very easy to spread disinformation in fragile democracies, and especially where you don't have robust media that can answer back, and particularly on issues of foreign affairs. So I'd say that the propaganda machine of the Russian Federation is very active in Latin America, and that has affected people's perceptions of Ukraine, and as I said, undermined a popular solidarity and empathy that used to exist. And I think it still exists at some level, depending on the country, as I said. But Russia understood that this was a very fertile ground for it to spread disinformation, especially taking advantage of anti-American sentiments in the region. And sadly, Claudia Sheinbaum, our new president, a woman, and the international press has underscored what I think are the least significant attributes she has, which is that she's a woman, that she's a scientist, that she is interested in climate change, making her appear more progressive than she actually is. A recent delegation of Ukrainians met with ministers from the Foreign Affairs Ministry here even last week, and Claudia Sheinbaum's government, I think, is not going to change its position on Ukraine. And even though Mexico at the United Nations tends to support resolutions in favor of Ukraine, at the recent peace conference, Mexico abstained from signing the communique that most Latin American countries signed. So that's why I say that Mexico is peculiar and not in a good way.
Right. That's very interesting. And if we're talking about democracy and autocracy, tomorrow I will make the podcast with Anne Applebaum, who you know, I think very well, and she just published this book, Autocracy Incorporated. So, and the argument of this book is, look, we are far away from the world where democracies were strong and where they formed a strong alliance. What we're facing right now is that new network of autocracies, or kind of a weakened democracies, or pretended illusionary democracies. What is happening in Mexico in this way? Do you think that it is going the same path as, for example, Orban's Hungary, or Modi's India? What is your estimation?
Yes, I think that is the regressive path that Mexico is treading, and I say this with great despair about my country. I recently published a book precisely on this issue, on democratic erosion and what Mexicans can do about it, which at this point seems like not much. What we're witnessing around the world, and Anne Applebaum, who I consider a colleague and a friend, explains this very well in her book, is that in the 1980s and 1990s, there was what Samuel Huntington called the third wave of democratization. You saw many Latin American dictatorships and other countries that had suffered authoritarian rule transition to democracy. And there was very good literature about this, the whole series of transitions from authoritarian rule, edited by Abraham Lowenthal and several other prominent U.S. academics. And there was a moment, I'd say probably 2 decades of democratic effervescence, of a sense that progress was linear, that finally we were leaving behind the dark days of military dictatorships. And what we've begun to witness, I'd say, in the past decade is a movement away from that democratic optimism. There's now a huge literature on democratic backsliding, as it's known, because it's capturing a sentiment and a reality that is occurring throughout the world. And you are right to underscore the case of Hungary, I'd say Poland until the recent election, India's Modi, even the United States. Now with the forthcoming election, which Donald Trump could very well win, and that would entail probably the end of American democracy as we have known it. And democratic backsliding has very similar characteristics around the world. It entails executive aggrandizement, a return to the strong men of the past. It entails the weakening of checks and balances. It entails destroying or weakening the guardrails of democracy that have to do with civil and political liberties and freedom of the press and freedom of expression. And there's a backlash against democracy because there's a backlash against liberalism in the world as well. And I think this has to do with things that democracy, particularly in countries where it was dysfunctional and it was incipient, democracy didn't solve huge issues of inequality, of corruption, of concentration of wealth, and it was viewed as very much an elite process that involve political parties far removed from the concerns of ordinary people. And I think the failures of liberalism, not as a political theory, but as in practice, in terms of public policy, to address those social cleavages, led to a very fertile ground for populist leaders to rail against elites, to rail against democratic procedures and rules, to say that democracies in reality were nothing more than a farcical charade that helped extractive elites continue being extractive and leading to massive disparities of wealth throughout the world. So you've seen the rise of these strongmen. In Latin America, it's the case of Venezuela, and you've seen it now for many years in Cuba, in Bukele's El Salvador, in Nicaragua with Ortega, and Mexico had been, I'd say, an emblematic example of a successful transition to electoral democracy. In 2000, we had an election that kicked the ruling party that had been in office for over 71 years. And we ended authoritarian rule and opened the door for, and I want to underscore this, electoral democracy. And that lasted only 18 years, because ultimately what happened is that a man who has presented himself as a leftist, although I would disagree with that label, López Obrador won in 2018 and then proceeded to replicate the very successful narrative that we've seen in other populist authoritarian leaders around the world display this rhetoric and have very successful results. And as a result, in Mexico over the past, I'd say 6-7 years, we've seen an erosion of basic things that we struggled for 20 years to create, like division of powers, checks and balances, autonomous institutions, freedom of the press. And all of this was vindicated at the let me rephrase that. Those generational conquests that my generation fought for now have been put into question. And I think there's been a strong electoral rejection of those democratic aspirations. In the election in 2024, Claudia Sheinbaum won with an overwhelming majority, and the opposition was basically decimated because this government has placed an emphasis, and I think what the key issue that has become the major weakness of democracies around the world, that has to do with social inequality. So it's a government that expanded social spending, social programs for the poor, and also used a very successful narrative of we represent the people, we are speaking for the dispossessed, for majorities that have long been ignored by racist, elitist governments. And so Mexico is now moving into the camp of democracies that are under siege. And now with a judicial reform that the current administration passed, because it managed to create a supermajority in Congress, in I'd say a very dishonest way, and I'm not going to go into the specifics, but the government has a supermajority in Congress. It does not need the votes of the opposition. And what they've done is pass this judicial reform that will entail that all ministers of the Supreme Court, all federal judges, all authorities of the Electoral Tribunal will be elected by the popular vote. And for many people, this sounds incredibly democratic. This is real democracy, as opposed to the facade of the past, of the travesty of the past. But in reality, what it means is that there will be a popular election dominated by the party in power that will then capture the judiciary. And as you've seen, even in the United States, in Trump's first administration, the judiciary acted as a guardrail against his worst tendencies. And that's what judiciaries do in democratic systems. They are an effective check and balance. And that's why you see populist leaders like Orban, like Erdogan in Turkey, for example, or I'd say even the case of Netanyahu in Israel trying to seize control of the courts. It's a power grab. And ultimately, it will dismantle what the weak institutional arrangements that we've been able to create over the past 20 years. And that's why it's so disturbing, so concerning for people like me, for activists in civil society, for minorities of every type, political and ethnic, and those people who are fighting for causes that go against what the ruling party has pushed forward, and now will be left basically defenseless vis-a-vis a judiciary completely controlled by the party that is in the government.
It's very good that you mentioned this concept of electoral democracy, because those who study a little bit the history of ideas, how the democratic ideas have been formed, understand that elections is not enough. You have to have independent institutions, and you have to have rule of law. And rule of law is not coming directly from elections. It is not coming directly from the vote of people, because you should have an independent judiciary power. And we are probably
Yes, I'd underscore another, I think, very interesting issue for those who are listening to us. Uh, the Nobel Prize in Economics was just awarded to three academics, two of whom, Darren Acemoglu and Robertson, um, have just published a book years ago in 2012. Um, called Why Nations Fail. And they had long sections on Mexico because they used it as an example of a country that never is able to achieve success despite being incredibly wealthy in terms of natural resources, having oil, an extraordinary geographical position in the world. And the failure lies with our inability to create strong, inclusive, predictable institutions that assure the rule of law. And our failure also lies with the continuity since colonial times of extractive elites that then seize control of economic and political power. And I'd say this is a constant for many countries in Latin America and in the global South. And even though we had electoral democracy, we had what we call alternancia, parties changing in power. That wasn't enough to create an inclusive political system or an inclusive economic system that generated rapid growth and lifted people out of poverty. And that's why we're seeing this backlash against electoral democracy. And the paradox of our times in Mexico and elsewhere is that you're seeing democracy die at the hands of elected officials who then, once they are in power, dismantle the very institutions that allowed them to arrive to power. And all this is done with popular support. Democracy dies to thunderous applause, as one of the protagonists of Star Wars says.
Well, this is what is called illiberal democracy. I think it's a concept by Farid Zakaria, or maybe it was earlier. But basically, this is what, as old times as the times of Tocqueville. Tocqueville said, when he was criticizing precisely democracy in North America, he was saying, "But look, the populace, the people, the majority can also be authoritarian when it forgets that it's not only the will of the people that matters, but there are some other things that matters. For example, the rule of law." But let me come back to Ukraine, because we've discussed, and you draw this very, very important picture of this these problems of democracies worldwide. In this situation, Ukraine is going to be in a very, very difficult situation. I have the impression that we are increasingly going into some kind of 1930s again, but not in Europe, but throughout the world, where we will be living probably in 2030s, or even earlier, in the world where democracies will be smaller. The number of democracies will be much smaller than in Europe or in North America, Latin America. We will have increasingly authoritarian regimes. In this situation, for Ukraine, the struggle, the fight against Russia will be extremely difficult, because we can now survive, of course, thanks to courage of Ukrainians, and thanks to this enormous sacrifice of human life, but also thanks to support from our partners. And our partners is the democratic world, Europe, America, and Southeast Asia, primarily. I mean Japan and South Korea and some other countries. But this, at the same time, it makes the Ukrainian fight so globally important, because it's an increasingly the fight of democracies who are becoming weaker but more endangered, against autocracies and autocratic challenge, both from inside and from the outside. What do you think?
No, absolutely. First of all, I want to correct myself. I said Acemoglu and Robertson. It's actually Acemoglu and Robinson, the Nobel Prize winners. But to respond to your question, uh, the democratic world is shrinking. It is becoming smaller as these authoritarian populisms and autocracies gain strength throughout the world. And this is the subject of Anne Applebaum's book. And we're seeing daily reminders of that being the case. The arrival of North Korean troops to Russia is, I think, an emblematic example of how these networks of autocracies support each other politically, financially, militarily, and also in terms of global narratives. And you're right, Ukraine has survived on the basis of support from democracies, but even those democracies may become illiberal. You're seeing the advance of the extreme right in many countries in Europe, of a very anti-immigrant discourse taking hold, and parties that are nativist, that are not cosmopolitan, that are not globalist, that do not even believe or are not necessarily supportive of the idea of a united Europe taking force once again. And yes, I find that today the work of historians of the interwar period in Europe is much more useful to me for understanding the current context than the work of political scientists, for example. Because I think that, as Timothy Snyder said in his book on tyranny, we're forgetting the lessons of the 20th century. And we're reproducing in the 21st century things that we should have learned from. And we're seeing people support movements, parties, governments, when we know what the outcome of those governments will be, and we should know better. And I say this also about my own country, because as a child, I lived through authoritarian rule in Mexico. I know what it's like. And to see it now return, but with a kind of leftist facade and support of the people, when what it's doing is extremely dangerous for individual rights, for everything that we understand as democracy that goes beyond elections. And yes, you're right. We're seeing the return of a liberal democracies, as Fareed Zakaria wrote many years ago. Democracies that are just democratic insofar as they have elections, but they don't respect constitutional rights. They don't respect the rights of minorities. They go after freedom of the press. They limit freedom of expression. And for example, in the case of Mexico, we will probably continue to have elections, but the rules of the game game have been rigged to such an extent that it will be virtually impossible for the opposition to ever win again. And I think that's what we're going to see in other countries as well, where leaders can say, of course, we're a democracy. Look, we have elections. Well, yes, there are elections in China, and there are elections in Cuba, and there are elections in Russia, but the same party always wins. The opposition is virtually non-existent. And how does this affect Ukraine? Insofar as you get governments that are inward looking, that are nativist, that are anti-immigrant, and that are in many ways illiberal and go against a series of democratic values, I think you're going to get less cooperation, collaboration in Europe, and also less of a sense of urgency and danger vis-a-vis the threat that Russia represents for freedom, global freedom in the future. And I'd say the same about China and North Korea and other countries that are using this moment of uncertainty and instability to try and become global players on the world scene and become an alternative to a bipolar world. And sadly, I think governments in the global south do not view, for example, Russia or China as a threat. And many autocratic governments are happy to do business with them because they feel that this provides them a modicum of independence vis-a-vis the United States, and that always plays well domestically and politically. But I think these are very troubling times. Hannah Arendt would call them dark times. And those of us who've been, beating the drum about the death of democracy in our own countries are increasingly becoming marginalized, or spaces for our voices are closing, or we're under constant attack by the government itself. And I think that every time I reflect on my own situation with a sense of woe. I was recently fired from a television program I'd been on for 14 years because this TV network wants to cater to the incoming government. And I think about what's happening here. And then I compare it to what I saw in Ukraine, and I check myself and I say, you are privileged to live in a country where you're not running to a bomb refuge every night, where a missile can land on your house and destroy your family, where hospitals are the subject of attack every day, and where part of the world is pressuring you to just give up the territory that Russia has claimed. And the world doesn't seem to understand that for Russia, it's not just an issue of gaining some territory. I think Putin truly believes that Ukraine should not exist as a country, that it is part of Russia. And that's why you see these efforts at Russification, the territories that Russia controls now being constitutionally part of the Russian Federation, this denial of Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian culture, the Ukrainian language. And if as a Mexican, if that were happening here, I would be on the front lines. So that's why I find it so incomprehensible that so many of my compatriots and my president are unwilling to fight the good fight in the diplomatic world. And I've often joked with my colleagues that if I ever get kicked out of Mexico by the current government, I'm going to Ukraine. So I hope you will accept
Of
me
course, you
there.
will be very welcomed here. You mentioned Hannah Arendt, and I can say that this conversation will be published on two podcasts that I run. One is called Explaining Ukraine, and another which I will launch soon, which is called Thinking in Dark Times. So it's a reference, of course, to Hannah Arendt. But let me tell you this thing. What you mentioned, that you're living in a country where you don't have to go to the bomb shelters. But my argument always to countries that are in peace is that, look, if Russia wins in Ukraine, then the whole idea of international law is doomed, because we will legitimize the violation of borders by force. And if you apply this to Latin America, you can have really big troubles. Because if you apply the concept of Ruski Mir, the Russian world, which is a key ideology of Russia today, to Latin America, and I will just remind our listeners that the concept of the Russian world implies that political borders do not matter, sovereignty of states do not matter, and it's a question of language. So everywhere where people speak, it's a certain language imperialism or language racism. It's difficult to explain, but this is how it works. It's not ethnic nationalism, but it's linguistic imperialism. Okay, and if you and therefore Russia claims that, look, people are speaking Russian in Belarus, therefore Belarus should be annexed. People are speaking partially Russian in Ukraine, then Ukraine should be. Ukraine should be aggressed. People are speaking Russian in Baltic countries, therefore we should expect probably invasion into the Baltic countries. And if you apply this concept to Latin America, you will have a nightmare because of Spanish language in so many countries. And if we really accept that Russia wins, uh, that, for example, Russia uses these tactics of proxy wars, that it funds just military militia groups elsewhere. It funded them in Ukraine. It funded them in African states. It's like Iran funding the paramilitary groups or military groups inside other countries like Lebanon or Gaza. And look, this means that it will be the end of this world where we have borders, where we have respect to sovereignty, and then we can expect in Latin America one of the country with authoritarian leaders saying, okay, everybody here speaks Spanish, so I will conquer other countries because I'm stronger. What do you think?
Oh, no, absolutely. I think that if Russia were to seize control of Ukraine, it means the end of the post World War II order that created a series of institutions, of rules that, by the way, countries have violated over the past 70 years, but never in such a blatant, aggressive, a brutal way as Russia. And one of the things that I was reminded of when I was in Ukraine is that Mexico is a signatory of the Rome Statute. We support the International Criminal Court, and yet the current president invited Putin to her official inauguration. And I remember the prosecutor, I'd call it the Attorney General of Ukraine, was saying Mexico should not be inviting a war criminal. And the fact that Claudia Sheinbaum did so, I think, is evidence of the erosion of those norms, those rules, where the power of the strongest is the power that wins, and that the limits that were created are constantly being defied. And if Russia gets away with what it's doing, what would stop any other country, China taking control of Taiwan, countries that are unhappy with their own borders in Latin America crossing those borders? So this is a significant challenge, and that's why I call these reminiscent of Hannah Arendt's book title "Dark Times," because as you said in our conversation in Ukraine, liberalism needs defenders. Democracy needs defenders. And sadly, the defenders of those ideas, we're not finding a language that connects with vast majorities that feel disenfranchised or feel that democracy doesn't work for them and are happy to subcontract their destiny to a strong leader, believing that that will entail a better future for them. When, if we learned the lessons of the 20th century, we would understand that that never works, that however flawed democracy and liberalism are, as unrealized aspirations in the world, the alternatives are far worse. There is no example of an authoritarian, totalitarian country that has brought huge benefits to its people. On the contrary, as time goes by and as economic policies issued by decree are enacted without consensus, without debate, without any basis on fact or reason or evidence or science, the flaws of those systems become evident. And I think Chernobyl was a very key example of the havoc that authoritarianism can wreak on just essential planning, essential capacity to carry out um, economic programs or welfare programs for the benefit of the people, or science on the basis of evidence. So it's not just about Russia's view of the world. It's about the fact that so many other countries are buying into this post-truth, post-science, post-meritocracy, post-elite world where truth is what the leader defines it is. The people are the segment of those who support him, and everyone else is considered an enemy of the people. We've seen it now with Donald Trump and the rhetoric he's using in the last stages of his own campaign. He's appealing to Hitler type rhetoric, to Mussolini type rhetoric, to things that we hadn't heard in a Western country for years, such as the enemy within. And this proto fascist language, I think, is extremely dangerous for the future of global cooperation, but for the future of countries themselves. Imagine a Trump victory where the New York Times endorsed Kamala Harris over the weekend. And the reason why, in a long editorial, the paper stated, Donald Trump has said that he's going to use the military against civilians, that he's going to deport millions of undocumented workers, and a series of other very dangerous proposals. And the paper said, you should believe him. So we're, I think, entering times in which strong men are redefining language, are redefining what democracy means, and are creating a new definition of words that is in their interest and not in the interest of the people that they seek to represent. And for me, that's why Ukraine is so important, because it's the last line of defense. When I was in Europe over the summer, I went to the Baltic states that are, I was surprised by their vibrancy, their innovation, their pride in the democratic systems they have created. Well, the Baltic states are now putting up metal and steel and concrete barriers on their highways, fearing a Russian invasion. So this takes me back to the 1930s, where because the aggressors were not stopped and because others were willing to emulate them, and there were facilitators and there were accomplices and there were people who thought appeasement was a better option, we ended up witnessing the horrors of the 20th century, which I hope will not be revisited upon us in the 21st century.
I hope too. I hope too. But I think we should be prepared for worst, because if we are prepared for worst, we are better prepared. And one of the mistakes was that Russia's aggressiveness was underestimated, and that the new fascism all over the world is considered by many people with liberal views as misunderstanding. Unfortunately, we have another wave right now, so we should be prepared and be ready for fight in on different levels, and sometimes even military ones. As Timothy Garton Ash said in Kiev, and you can listen to this conversation in our podcast, and he was quoting Antonio Gramsci. I think he says, pessimism of intellect, optimism of will. So we should be very aware of the dark things around us, but believe that if we act, we can change something.
Yes, I actually love that quote. And for our listeners, I'm going to, because I know it, I'm going to say it in Spanish. El pesimismo de la inteligencia y el optimismo de la voluntad. The optimism of will. And I remain optimistic in my will and the will of many others who are defending democracy throughout the world as we speak, and send this message to Ukrainians, at least from what I can say of myself. You are not alone, and I am here.
Thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure, and glory to Ukraine. And I hope that the next several months look less bleak for you.
Glory to heroes. Thank you. This was a podcast by UkraineWorld, a multilingual media about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, chief editor of UkraineWorld and president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today was Denise Dresser, a prominent Mexican political analyst, columnist, and academic. Let me remind you that you can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. You can also support our volunteer trips to the war zones at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.